The Minecore Labyrinth stood at the far end of the Galactic Apex Academy's eastern training grounds, half buried into the obsidian cliffs that overlooked the floating plains of Tixor. From a distance, it appeared like a broken scar on the surface of the planet, an ancient angular structure of black metal and flickering panels that pulsed faintly with violet light. No doors, no windows, no visible scene. Only a slanted triangular archway served as its entrance, and above it, etched in both glowing glyphs and primal claw marks, were the words, "Enter only if the mind you offer is your own." Students of all species spoke of it in whispers, and the farther one was from the maze, the louder the stories became. It wasn't merely a test. It was a relic from an older time, before the Academy even existed. When ancient psychic architects designed trials meant not just to challenge intellect, but to reveal the truth beneath identity. To survive the labyrinth was to face one's perception of reality and live with the result. Few completed it. Some emerged mentally broken, others were removed from the academy altogether. There were stories of students who entered and simply never came back. Their signals vanished, their bodies never recovered. For centuries, it had been regarded as a threshold reserved for the top echelon, those with the highest neural bandwidth, the fastest thought streams, or the strongest mental conditioning. Professor Exiler, the six-eyed Threnthian who chaired cognitive warfare and neural tactics, called it the purifier of delusions. He believed that only species with shared conscious networks, like the Cephalarii or the Phil-10 triminds, had any chance of comprehending the spatial spiritual logic the labyrinth used. His species had built minds into architecture, encoded ethics into walls, and believed that the labyrinth would reveal insanity as easily as it revealed genius. Each semester, volunteers from among the upper-tier classes were given the option to enter it. Only a few ever accepted. Those who returned often did so in silence, their confidence shaken, their perspective fractured. Some couldn't speak about what they had seen. Others dismissed the experience with trembling jokes. The maze was a rite of passage among elites, but for most, it was more myth than opportunity, a challenge for those who believed their minds were stronger than their fears. This semester was different. Among the gathered students at the eastern grounds stood a human cadet, tall but not imposing, his uniform standard but slightly wrinkled, as if he hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. His name was Eli Grant, and this was only his second week on the campus. He wasn't genetically modified, he wasn't neurally optimized. He didn't come from a noble house or any prestigious planetary line. He came from Earth, a death world that others spoke of with equal parts awe and suspicion. Those students still couldn't decide whether humans were insane, lucky, or terrifying, probably all three. Eli had been quiet since arrival, spending his evenings alone in the Academy's lower libraries, scanning holographic archives or solving ancient tactical drills most students ignored. He rarely engaged in class discussions unless prompted, and when he did speak, it was usually short and precise, not unfriendly, but undeniably detached. He smiled more with his eyes than his mouth. Rumors had begun to form around him, fueled by the natural curiosity alien students had toward Deathworlders. One claimed he'd once survived a landslide by riding the avalanche down on a stolen hoverboard. Another said he'd outrun a forest predator using nothing but adrenaline and poor judgment. None of them knew the truth. Eli never confirmed or denied any of it. Now he stood before the entrance to the Minecore Labyrinth, hands in the pockets of his academy coat, gazing up at the flickering glyphs. Behind him, a semicircle of alien students watched in confused silence. Several species murmured among themselves, concerned, curious, slightly amused. To them, the idea of a second-week human entering the labyrinth bordered on lunacy. Even among top-performing races, students typically waited at least one full rotation before attempting entry. Professor Xylor hovered forward, his multi-jointed limbs twitching in rhythmic contemplation. He examined the human with all six of his eyes. His voice came in musical chords that were translated through a hovering orb at his side. "Human Grant, are you aware of what lies beyond this threshold?" he asked. "This is not a simulation. The labyrinth reads the mind. It reflects and distorts. It will use what you know against you, and what you don't know, it will create." Eli didn't flinch. "That's fine," he said. "I've had teachers like that." A few alien cadets chuckled. One cephalarii clicked his throat vents in disbelief. Professor X Hylor's eyes narrowed in subtle surprise. He studied the human a moment longer, then gestured to the entrance. The archway responded with a pulse of indigo light. The internal panels rearranged themselves into a pathway barely wide enough for a single person. The air within shimmered, dense with psychoreactive particles. "Proceed at will," the professor said. 12 minutes is the average failure time. Eli nodded once. No grand speech, no dramatic preparation. He simply stepped forward, disappearing into the radiant haze. The entrance sealed behind him with a low thrum that resonated across the cliff. Silence followed. Students watched the now sealed wall, some with arms crossed, others shaking their heads. One whispered, "Poor creature won't last 5 minutes." Another muttered, "It's a shame, he seemed decent." Only Professor Excylor remained perfectly still. His translator orb flickered slightly, as if echoing his own hidden question. What do humans truly see when reality bends? The clock began to count. The corridor that swallowed Eli was not made of stone or metal in the traditional sense. The interior of the Mind Core labyrinth shifted with every breath he took. The walls had no texture, only suggestion. Color, light, shadow, and geometry all danced in a constantly fluctuating rhythm. It wasn't just disorienting, it was actively resisting comprehension. Angles formed that couldn't exist in Euclidean space. Corridors curved into themselves, then straightened. Steps appeared and vanished. His first step was cautious, his second was confident. By the third, the entrance behind him had vanished completely. He paused and let his breath settle. The air wasn't air, more like memory in gaseous form. Scents past that didn't exist, rain on concrete, a burnt sandwich, summer chlorine. The maze didn't just sense thought, it fed on it, echoing fragments of memory to lure the mind into reacting, hesitating, crumbling. Eli didn't resist it. He allowed it to swirl around him, let it crawl over his senses without giving it meaning. He didn't try to fight the illusion. He waited for patterns to emerge. He knew this feeling. Not exactly, of course. Nothing on Earth resembled this psychic structure, but the mechanism felt familiar. It was like the dreams he used to have after staying up too late solving logic puzzles. Those dreams didn't obey rules, but they still had rhythm, a cadence of contradictions that, once you gave in, allowed you to move forward. So he didn't force his steps. He let his subconscious tug him. He turned right at a corridor that had no turn. When the floor changed direction, he didn't blink. The hallway dropped vertically, and he let himself fall, because he knew falling was only a metaphor here. Sure enough, he landed softly in a chamber that shouldn't have fit within the structure's spatial volume. It looked like a dome carved out of moonlight, filled with floating cubes of translucent material. Each cube showed a flickering image, scenes from memory, maybe from dreams. One showed a child watching fireworks alone. Another displayed a math test smeared with ketchup. A third, an image of a staircase spiraling into a mouth. He ignored them all. The cubes hovered closer, as if offended. When he didn't look, they turned violent. They shattered with deafening cracks, releasing bursts of sound, screams, explosions, sobs. It was a sensory assault designed to provoke panic. He closed his eyes, counted to 5, breathed, and the sound died. Not because the maze let go, but because it learned he wouldn't play. The next corridor was colder. Light here bent differently. The walls glowed with an oily shimmer, reflecting warped images of his face. Sometimes older, sometimes bleeding, sometimes smiling. In one reflection, he looked back at himself and shook his head. Eli chuckled softly and walked past. In the observation tower above the labyrinth, Professor Xylor stood before a translucent display orb that mapped Eli's vitals and route as much as it could. But the maze scrambled most data. What should have been clean neural activity was instead a thicket of chaotic peaks and valleys. His heartbeat was steady, too steady. Blood pressure normal. Cognitive stress, unreadable. The maze was reacting to him, adapting in real time. One assistant noted that the architecture had changed, form 6 times faster than average. "He's not resisting," said Professor Exhaler. "He's absorbing." Back inside, Eli reached the first proper test. The walls opened into a room shaped like a triangle, stretched across 4 dimensions. He couldn't describe how he knew that, but he felt it. The air hummed with intention. At the center of the room stood 3 platforms, each marked by a spinning orb. One orb pulsed with light in sync with his breathing, another mirrored his posture exactly. The third, however, did neither. It sat still, humming low. The challenge was obvious. The student had to choose the orb that aligned with his true self. The wrong choice would lead to madness or infinite loops. He circled the platforms twice. Most students tried to match logic, breath pattern, body symmetry, neural trace. But Eli approached it differently. He sat down, not on the platforms, on the floor. He folded his legs, rested his hands, and simply waited. After a minute, the first orb, the breathing one, flickered nervously. The second began to speed up. The third remained still. Eli chose the third. The moment his fingers touched it, the room inverted like a negative photograph. Light bent inward. The floor shifted into a slope, and the orb melted into his skin, not painfully, but like ink soaking into paper. The platform dropped, and he was lowered into a new corridor, one made of stairs that coiled inward like a spiral shell. Each step triggered memory, a voice from his past, a mistake he regretted, an emotion long buried. But the maze was too late. He had already rehearsed all of these things, years ago, during sleepless nights and childhood traumas. Nothing here could be new, not to him. He passed through a gate made of glass that cracked but didn't shatter. The next chamber was filled with ticking sounds, as if hundreds of clocks were moving out of sync. On the floor, a grid. On the ceiling, mirrored numbers. He smiled. This was a puzzle. He crouched, traced the floor tiles with his fingers, then glanced up. The numbers on the ceiling weren't alien. They weren't even that obscure. It was a Sudoku sequence, modified slightly but undeniably Earth-based. Or perhaps the labyrinth had drawn it from him. That meant it could be solved. He did it in under 30 seconds. The door opened before he even stood up. It was at this moment, approximately minute 5 of his run, that Professor Exilor leaned closer to the observation panel. His voice dropped into a contemplative hum. No hesitation, no verbal reaction. He isn't navigating the maze, he's conversing with it. None of the assistant analysts had seen anything like it. The average alien cadet, even among the top percentile, hit resistance between minutes 6 and 9. Either psychological distress or total disorientation caused retreat or extraction. But Eli wasn't just moving forward, he was accelerating. Inside, he encountered what most would call the emotional trial. It was a hallway lined with moments of personal guilt, projected through light and sound. But instead of staggering or flinching, he walked calmly. When the image of his mother crying appeared, he nodded. When the sound of himself failing to save a friend echoed around him, he paused, whispered a silent apology, and moved on. Each memory sharpened and softened in response, trying to sting deeper. But he refused the bait, not out of coldness, but because he had already made peace with imperfection. The hallway ended. The next room was dark, total void. No floor, no ceiling, just Eli floating in pure black, held in place by nothing. Here, most cadets broke. This was the isolation chamber, a space designed to nullify identity, to make the mind collapse into itself. Eli closed his eyes. In the dark, he imagined the first maze he ever solved, a paper puzzle on the back of a cereal box when he was 5. His fingers traced invisible lines, left, up, down, right, repeat. His breath matched the rhythm. The darkness flickered. A pinpoint of light opened. He swam toward it, not with his body, but with his intent. And just like that, the floor returned beneath his feet. The walls reassembled. The corridor ahead stretched wide and bright. He exhaled once and walked forward. Time, 10 minutes, 43 seconds. And the final chamber had just begun to form. The final chamber didn't appear all at once. It unfolded unhearing. First as sound, then as temperature, and only last as light. The walls did not rise. Instead, they emerged slowly from nothingness, as if being remembered into existence. Eli stepped into a room that was not a room, but a shifting illusion stitched together from contradiction. It was vast, yet closed, silent, yet filled with sound, bright, but without a source of illumination. The floor beneath his feet responded to each step with ripples that spread across the air instead of the ground, Above him, gravity bent in unnatural angles. Distant objects appeared simultaneously near and impossibly far. A single step in any direction warped the room's orientation, as if the space itself refused to commit to geometry. The labyrinth had exhausted its tricks, and now it threw everything into this last stand, not to frighten him, but to break his capacity for comprehension. But Eli didn't approach it with logic. He approached it like a game. He stood still for a moment, letting the environment shift around him. Patterns formed in the chaos. A jagged hum emerged, rising and falling like breath. The walls, translucent and vibrating, showed flashes of landscapes, languages, symbols. For others, this would be overwhelming, a sensory deluge, but Eli had seen confusion before. His father once told him that true intelligence wasn't the ability to solve anything. It was the ability to sit with uncertainty long enough to understand it. He walked forward. With each step, the room reshaped. The walls became corridors, the corridors became spirals, the spirals collapsed into columns of light. The entire space bent itself into a new form, a cube turning itself inside out over and over, inviting him to lose track of direction, of motion, of time. But Eli had stopped measuring things by external cues. Instead, he listened to the rhythm, the pulse within the distortion. It wasn't random. The maze was speaking. It was asking a question. So he answered. He stopped walking. The transformation halted. A single object formed at the center of the space. A floating sphere, smooth and glass-like, rotating slowly in place. Inside it, countless images flickered. Fragments of faces, distant star maps, brief flashes of horror, joy, and silence. It was not a test. It was a mirror. Eli stepped closer, his own reflection warping across its curved surface. He didn't expect answers. He didn't look for something to solve. Instead, he asked a single question aloud. "What do you want to show me?" The sphere pulsed. From its core, a line of light extended, thin as a needle, straight as memory, and pointed to a wall that hadn't existed a second before. On that wall, a door shimmered into view. Unlike the rest of the maze's architecture, this door was simple, rectangular, made of old wood with a brass handle. It didn't belong here. And yet, it belonged perfectly. He recognized it. It was the door to his childhood bedroom. He approached it slowly, his heart beginning to pound, not from fear, but from something deeper. Nostalgia edged with hesitation. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the knob. The brass was warm. He turned it. The door opened into a small room filled with shelves. No ceiling, no floor, just floating platforms and hundreds of books, real ones, with paper and stitched spines. In the center of the room sat a desk with a single chair. On the desk, a puzzle box made of interlocking wooden shapes. He stepped forward and sat. The puzzle had no markings, no starting point, just wood, angles, and potential. But something in him knew. This was the core of the labyrinth. Not a riddle to be solved, a creation waiting to be understood. He turned the box. The wood clicked. He shifted one edge, and the sound of distant voices filled the air. Laughter, faint like memory. He twisted a corner, and the air changed temperature, cool like autumn. He pressed one tile, and his name echoed softly from somewhere far away. It was a memory engine. The maze had reached inside his subconscious and assembled a final task not based on fear, not on intelligence, but on self. Each movement through the box unfolded a layer of himself. The more he engaged, the more personal it became, not painfully, but intimately. He smiled as old friends passed through his mind. Failures, victories. That moment he realized math wasn't about numbers, but about patterns. The time he failed to swim across a lake but laughed anyway. The way he held silence during arguments, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He completed the box, not by force, but by recognition. The last piece slid into place. The puzzle dissolved into golden dust. And then came silence. True silence. The kind that didn't feel empty, but full. The space faded around him, and he was standing once again in a corridor. This one was narrow, carved from stone, real stone. There was no illusion here, no warping light, no fractal corners, just a path ahead and a faint breeze. A breeze meant an exit. He walked toward it. The wind grew stronger. The light brightened. Each step felt lighter than the last, and then, without warning, the final threshold appeared. A metal arch, plain, unadorned, no lights, no symbols, just an open doorway leading back into the world. He stepped through. As soon as he crossed, the maze closed behind him, seamless, silent, cold. The observers in the control tower froze. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The timer had stopped at 12 minutes and 2 seconds. Eli Grant stood at the exit, expression calm, eyes wide open. Not with arrogance, but awareness. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't shaking. He looked like someone who had just taken a long walk in a strange place and come back with something quiet and important. The academy was no longer silent. It was stunned. As the archway of the Mine Core labyrinth sealed itself behind him, Eli remained standing for a moment on the polished obsidian slab just beyond the threshold. The soft breeze that had guided him to the exit had faded, replaced by the heavy, anticipatory stillness of dozens of onlookers. Above him, in the observation dome, the professors and their aides stood frozen around glowing consoles and flickering telemetry streams. Below, in the amphitheater carved into the cliffside, students from every major species remained locked in collect. No one moved. The wind that occasionally swept across the plains did not return. Even the insects, tiny floating bioluminescent creatures that buzzed through the Tixorian atmosphere, seemed to have gone still. Eli looked up once toward the dome but did not raise a hand or nod. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His expression was unreadable. What he carried now was not pride but clarity, like a person who had seen something vast and unshakable and returned slightly quieter because of it. The first one to move was Professor Zai. He stepped back from the glowing interface with an unsettling grace only his multi-limbed species could achieve. All 6 of his eyes blinked in slow rotation, each focusing separately as if trying to stitch together the enormity of what had occurred. For a Threnthian, silence was rare. It signified awe, an emotion usually reserved for starbirths or psychic harmonies. 12 minutes, he finally said aloud, his voice resonating through the tower's speaker array. 12 minutes and 2 seconds. His voice rolled down into the amphitheater like thunder. Several cadets turned to look at each other in disbelief. A few scoffed nervously, not out of amusement, but out of confusion. One Cephalarii student clenched his mandibles. A Yalari with crystalline skin squinted and muttered something about the integrity of the labyrinth having been compromised. None of them believed what had just happened. And yet the timer on the external terminal didn't lie. The maze had been entered. The maze had been completed, and the human had returned. Eli walked forward along the marked path that led from the structure toward the gathering crowd. His boots tapped softly against the obsidian stone, each step echoing with finality. He didn't rush. He didn't drag his feet. His pace was natural, unremarkable, as though he had merely been out on an afternoon stroll. When he reached the midpoint of the path, the silence broke with the sharp hiss of hydraulics, the viewing dome retracting its base to allow the instructors to descend onto the platform below. Professor Zaylor emerged first. He was followed by 2 of the cognitive science chairs, one from the Felten Collective, the other from the more conservative Zareen Mental Discipline faculty. Behind them came 4 assistants, holding tablets, neural imprint scanners, and light field recorders. Eli stopped when the group reached him. He waited, hands still loosely at his sides, eyes focused on the professor. "Human Cadet Eli Grant," Zaylor began, projecting his voice not just to the student before him, but to the audience, still watching in frozen fascination. "In 12 minutes and 2 seconds, you traversed a labyrinth whose architecture has confounded neural collectives, fractured psychic unions, and resisted direct artificial computation since its discovery. You returned uninjured, coherent, and apparently unchanged. Explain how." Eli tilted his head slightly. "Do you want the real answer or the impressive one?" Zaylor blinked once. "The real one." Eli shrugged lightly. "I didn't try to beat it. I listened." Pause. Zaylor's leftmost eye twitched in reaction. The others remained still. "You listened," he repeated. "Yes," Eli said. "It wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to communicate. Confuse, sure. Test me. But it was never hostile. It just echoed, what it was given. One of the assistants leaned forward and whispered into the Zerine professor's auditory port. The professor nodded slowly, then gestured to the tablet screen, showing a recorded echo of Eli's internal biofeedback. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, neural activity, all astonishingly smooth. The Felten representative narrowed her eyes, her 3 silver irises rotating inward, the sign of intellectual recalibration. No fear response, she muttered. No resistance either, the Zerine added. The conversation began to swirl among the professors, but Eli stood still. He had no interest in their analysis. He wasn't here to be dissected. He had accepted the invitation of the maze, played its game, and returned. That was enough for him. A voice called out from the edge of the gathering. A student, a tall, dark-skinned Varnexi whose crest plate shimmered with nervous energy, stepped forward. "Did you see the reflection chamber?" Eli turned to him. "I passed through it," he replied. "You weren't, affected?" "I was affected," Eli answered calmly. "Just not dismantled." That answer, short, precise, and irrefutable, cut through the gathering like a whisper through flame. Suddenly everyone was talking. Not aloud. Not yet. But the tension fractured into 1,000 mental fragments as rumors, theories, admiration, and fear bled into the air like ink into water. Professor Xylor raised one hand. "Enough," he said. "The Academy does not thrive on chaos. It thrives on truth. This human has just rewritten the parameters of a challenge long thought immutable. Let the record reflect that a cadet of Earth has completed the Mind Core Labyrinth with a time of 12 minutes and 2 seconds. The previous record was 16 hours and 17 minutes. It is no longer relevant." He turned to Eli once more. "Report to my office tomorrow at dawn. I will debrief you personally." Eli nodded once. "Understood." Then he turned and walked away, not toward the dormitories, not toward the dining halls or study centers. He walked along the cliff's edge path that curved gently toward the outer edge of the campus, where no one else went during lecture hours, where silence could stretch out without interruption. He needed no applause, no celebration. The maze had already given him what he came for, an answer he hadn't even known he was asking. Far behind him, the murmurs continued. Some spoke of how Earth must have trained him with labyrinths of their own. Others speculated about genetic advantages or hidden implants, but none could explain how he had moved through a space designed to unmake minds without ever being unmade himself. And for the first time in decades, the phrase Death Worlder meant something new. Not dangerous, not wild, but inevitable. Eli sat alone on the outcrop that overlooked the outer ridge of the Tyxorian cliffs. The Academy buildings glowed in the distance, their shimmering towers humming softly under the twin suns now beginning their descent behind the jagged horizon. His jacket lay beside him, folded neatly on the warm stone. A small breeze threaded through his short hair, carrying with it the metallic scent of ionized air and distant rain. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The labyrinth was gone now, not physically but spiritually. It had become memory, not a battle, not a competition, but a passage. And now that passage was complete, and what remained was a quiet reshuffling of everything he thought he knew about himself and everything others thought they knew about his kind. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps crunched against the thin gravel path. He didn't turn. "Grant," came the voice, measured, deep, layered with artificial resonance. Eli didn't need to look to know it was Professor Xylor. "I thought you might come," Ellie said quietly. The professor stopped several steps behind him but didn't sit. "For most students," Xylor said, "we conduct post-trial evaluations with neural scans, verbal interviews, and a series of psychological calibrations. But I believe you've earned a deviation from standard protocol." Eli turned his head slightly. "Are you here to evaluate me?" "I am here to understand," Xylor replied. Eli looked back out toward the setting suns. The sky had taken on a soft violet hue, bleeding into amber clouds streaking across the horizon. He picked up a small stone beside him, rotated it once in his fingers, then set it down again. "The labyrinth doesn't want domination," Ellie said. "It wants acknowledgement. It's a mirror. It doesn't collapse your mind. It shows you where your mind already folds." Xylor's second left eye blinked slowly. "I've studied the mind core structure for over 40 years, the professor said. "I have mapped its fractal shifts, logged hundreds of cadet failures. And yet, I could not anticipate how a human cadet, on his second week, would not only enter it, but leave it intact. Eli shrugged faintly. Because you thought it had to be solved. The professor took another step forward. You're saying it does. I'm saying it's not a math problem, Eli said. It's not a code. It's a presence. It wants to be understood, but not through force. The more you try to beat it, the more it fights back. But when you stop treating it like an opponent, he trailed off and exhaled softly. Xylor stepped closer and finally sat beside him. Not directly next to him, but close enough that his shadow merged with Eli's on the stone. You said something earlier, the professor said, that it echoed what it was given. Yes. Then what did you give it? Eli was quiet for a long moment. I gave it honesty, he said. Not confidence, not fear, just myself. Nothing hidden, nothing performed. I think that's why it let me through. A faint hum from the professor's core resonator pulsed once. It was a sign of contemplation. Among the Threnthians it was equivalent to a long sigh or a quiet nod. The professor did not speak further. He didn't offer praise or question the implications. He simply absorbed the answer and let it rest. They sat in silence as the final sliver of sun dipped behind the western peaks. Light turned soft blue. Far below, the floating fields began to shimmer, dense patches of atmospheric algae blinking softly with bioluminescence, a natural response to the day's end. Eventually, Xylor stood. You have shifted the conversation of this academy, he said. For better or worse, your actions will ripple for decades. I didn't mean to, Eli replied. That's precisely why it matters. The professor left then, his form receding slowly down the path and into the deepening dusk. Eli remained. The breeze picked up again, cooler now, and carried with it a scent he couldn't place. Not earthborn, not alien, but something in between, like something the labyrinth might have left behind in his senses. Some trace of that ancient, knowing intelligence. He didn't try to name it. He simply let it exist. The next day, the Academy released its official statement. It was brief, almost clinical in tone, but the message was clear. A human cadet had completed the Minecore Labyrinth in a time previously thought impossible. The data was made public, the protocols were updated, the curriculum revised. But the more significant change couldn't be measured. It was in the way students looked at him as he passed in the corridors. Not with mockery now, not even with envy, with curiosity. The kind of curiosity that followed pioneers, that followed explorers who had seen something others couldn't yet imagine. And it wasn't just him. By the third week, 2 other students, one Felton and one hybrid Sciorian, attempted the labyrinth. Not to break records, but to listen. Neither completed it, but neither collapsed either. Something had changed in the approach, and that was the beginning of a new paradigm. A quiet revolution in thought, sparked not by force or intellect, but by stillness. Eli never returned to the labyrinth. He never needed to. He had already carried it with him, reshaped and silent, a part of his inner map now, one. One more path in a galaxy of many. And for the first time, the Academy truly understood what a Deathworlder was. Not a warrior, not a beast, but a mirror, walking among stars, reflecting what others were too afraid to see.